On a desolate highway in California, an old car suddenly catches the attention of two patrolling officers. A routine traffic stop quickly escalates into a tense situation, and when they open the trunk, everything changes. What seemed like a simple check now hides secrets that no one could have anticipated. Is it a training mannequin? Or something far more sinister waiting behind the door? Could this hasty action lead to a career-ending mistake and an irreparable crisis? You won't be able to predict what happens next. Brian Harris popped the trunk, expecting to find some typical tools, maybe a spare tire. But he stopped dead in his tracks. Inside was a man in a full police uniform, motionless, his face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. This wasn't just a suspicious situation. It was the spark that would ignite a chaos no one saw coming, all starting with a routine traffic stop on an empty highway. The road was long, dry, and empty, with nothing but a few pieces of tumbleweed and the low hum of Brian Harris's patrol car. Brian Harris, a police officer in his 30s who enjoyed the thrill of his job, leaned back in his seat, his sunglasses reflecting the quiet highway. Beside him was Ethan Miller, his nervous rookie partner, fidgeting with the radio. "Hey, Ethan Miller," Brian Harris spoke abruptly, his voice sharp as he spotted a 1987 Chevrolet Caprice in the distance. Its confident speed made Brian Harris uneasy. "Look at that old car. Let's see what he's up to." Ethan Miller immediately pulled over, eager to show off his skills. Without hesitation, he flipped on the sirens. The Caprice slowed and stopped with such precision that it made Brian Harris pause. As he approached the vehicle, he adjusted his belt, bracing for what he thought would be a simple stop that didn't feel right. Behind the wheel was a man in his 60s, calm, his demeanor suggesting a military discipline honed over many years. His black suit was pressed neatly, and his gaze met Brian's with quiet confidence. "Good afternoon, officers," the man greeted in a steady voice, handing over his driver's license and registration without hesitation. Brian Harris took the documents and quickly shifted his attention to the car. His eyes caught something odd, a piece of dark fabric protruding from the trunk, resembling part of a uniform. "What's in the trunk?" Brian asked, his tone sharp. The man's calm demeanor didn't waver. "A mannequin," he replied simply. "A mannequin? Really?" Brian raised an eyebrow, his voice tinged with doubt. "Open it up." The man sighed lightly, unresisting, got out of the car, and approached the trunk. With a smooth motion, he unlocked it and opened the lid. Brian leaned in closer, then froze. Inside was a fully uniformed police officer, badge, patch, everything. Brian's mind spun, alarm bells ringing in his head. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, stepping back and grabbing his radio. "Ethan Miller, call for backup. This guy's got a cop's body in his trunk." The man remained calm, shaking his head. "It's a mannequin for training purposes," he explained, but his words fell on deaf ears. "Hands on the car." Brian barked, his voice echoing in the quiet highway. His hands hovered near his cuffs as he stepped closer, ready for what he assumed would be a memorable arrest. Ethan Miller hesitated, glancing back and forth between Brian and the man. "Brian Harris, maybe we should check with backup first," he said cautiously. "What?" Brian snapped. "Do you see this? This isn't a mannequin. Let's go." The man placed his hands on the hood of the car without resistance, his face unreadable, almost bored, as though he had seen this scene 1,000 times before. Meanwhile, Brian Harris, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline, prepared for an arrest he was sure would make waves. The man's calmness only fueled his frustration. To Brian, the lack of panic meant the man was hiding something, and he was determined to find out what. "You really think I'm buying this mannequin story?" Brian snarled, handcuffing the man with more force than necessary. "You're under arrest. We'll figure this out once you're in a cell." Ethan Miller stood nearby, unease clear on his face. As a rookie, he was eager to follow orders, but he could sense that things weren't going according to plan. "Brian Harris," Ethan murmured, leaning in, "don't you think we should wait for backup? This doesn't feel right." Brian Harris turned, a mocking smirk on his face. "Backup? You scared of this old man, Ethan Miller? Look at him. Something's definitely off." I'm not letting him go until I know exactly what's going on. The man remained silent, unfazed. His gaze steady. It seemed as though he had expected this moment. You have something to say? Brian Harris shouted, his voice rising. Just standing there. Like you can't be touched? Finally, the man spoke, his tone calm and deliberate. I've already told you, it's a mannequin. That's the truth. You might want to listen before things go too far. Brian Harris scoffed. Who do you think you are, giving advice? A few minutes later, the sound of tires grinding over gravel signaled the arrival of another patrol car. Two officers stepped out, one of them immediately exuding authority. It was Lieutenant James Foster, a seasoned officer with no patience for nonsense. What's going on here? James Foster asked, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Brian Harris didn't waste a second. This guy's driving with a cop's body in his trunk. He pointed toward the open trunk, clearly eager to flaunt his find. We're talking full uniform badge, the whole deal. James Foster raised an eyebrow, walked toward the trunk, and took one look. That's a mannequin. James Foster's voice was cold, turning to Brian Harris with a hint of frustration. It's a mannequin, didn't you see? Brian Harris opened his mouth to argue, but James Foster cut him off. No, Brian Harris. Let me guess, you didn't look closely because you were too busy playing the hero. Brian Harris's face turned red, rage and embarrassment flooding his senses. It's too suspicious. Who drives around with something like that in their trunk? Ignoring Brian's weak protest, James Foster turned to the man. Sir, could you explain why there's a mannequin in your trunk? Despite being handcuffed, the man didn't show any signs of panic. He nodded. Of course. I'm General Robert Smith, U.S. Army. This mannequin is part of a tactical training program. I'm transporting it to a facility for a demonstration this afternoon. A brief silence hung in the air, the man's words settling in, causing James Foster's expression to shift from irritation to clear concern. Brian Harris stood still, his face pale, feeling like everything was crashing down. Oh, General, Ethan Miller whispered, almost inaudibly. Yes, Smith replied, then turned to James Foster. Now, I'd appreciate it if someone would take these cuffs off me and explain why I'm being interrupted like this. James Foster stepped forward, retrieved the key, and unlocked the cuffs. Smith, I apologize for the misunderstanding, he said, his voice sincere. This officer overstepped his bounds. Brian Harris stood frozen, mouth agape, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Ethan Miller swallowed hard, stepping back as if trying to distance himself from the brewing storm. As the cuffs were removed, Smith calmly adjusted his sleeve, his composure unchanged. General, I'll let you handle this in your way, Smith said to James Foster, but he didn't forget to add, I suggest you address this behavior before it further damages the department's reputation. James Foster nodded seriously. Yes, sir. I'll take care of it. Smith gave a short nod before heading toward his car. Brian Harris stood there, staring after him, his eyes wide in disbelief. The patrol lights reflected off the sleek, black Caprice, a harsh reminder of an irreversible failure. James Foster turned to Brian Harris, his face darkened. You need to explain yourself, and I expect a reasonable explanation, he said. Ethan Miller avoided looking at Brian, clearly unwilling to get caught up in this mess. Both officers sensed that everything had gone off course, and the silence that followed Smith's departure made everything feel even heavier. James Foster looked at the ID card, his eyes glued to it as if unable to believe what he was seeing. Silence enveloped the scene, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. After a moment, he sighed heavily and looked up at Brian Harris, his face a mix of disappointment and barely contained anger. Do you know who you just handcuffed? James Foster's voice was low, just loud enough for Brian Harris to hear, but the weight of his words hit like a freight train. Brian Harris fumbled for words, unable to respond. I was just doing my job, he mumbled, his voice weak, trapped in the crushing embarrassment. Your job? James Foster snapped, his tone sharp. You just handcuffed a U.S. Army general. Do you get that? You've just caused a disaster. This isn't just a bad day at work, Brian Harris. This is a lawsuit that could ruin your career. Brian Harris's face drained of color, but he remained silent, unwilling to meet Ethan Miller's eye, who James Foster hurriedly took the keys and unlocked the handcuffs, his tone serious. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, sir," he said with formal politeness. "I assure you, this officer's actions do not reflect the standards of our department." Smith rubbed his wrists briefly before glancing at Brian Harris, his gaze cold but still composed. "Officer," he began, his voice calm, "let's be clear. I'm in a forgiving mood today, but this behavior is unacceptable. It's a lack of decisiveness, authority, and professionalism. You should consider yourself fortunate I have bigger priorities to handle with this situation." Brian Harris opened his mouth to speak, but realized there was nothing more to say. He could only nod, standing there like a child being reprimanded by the principal. Smith turned back to James Foster. "I trust this matter will be handled properly." "Absolutely, sir," James Foster replied, his voice firm. "You have my word." Smith nodded briefly before getting into the car. The black Caprice roared to life, its powerful engine revving as it sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The highway scene grew unnervingly silent. James Foster turned back to face Brian Harris, his teeth clenched. "What were you thinking?" he yelled. "You acted recklessly, embarrassed this department, and put us all in a terrible situation." I didn't think," Brian Harris stammered. "That's the problem, Brian Harris. You didn't think," James Foster snapped. "You saw an opportunity to play hero, and now we all have to clean up your mess." Ethan Miller stood back, clearly wishing he could vanish. James Foster glanced at Ethan Miller briefly before turning his attention toward him. "You rookie, don't blindly follow orders when something feels off. Speak up and use your brain." "Yes, sir," Ethan Miller mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ground. James Foster sighed again, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Brian Harris, you're on leave until further notice. Tomorrow morning, I expect you in my office. And you better have a good explanation." Brian Harris nodded, muttering a barely audible, "Yes, sir." James Foster walked back to the car, and Ethan Miller hesitated for a moment before approaching Brian Harris. "Hey, are you okay?" Ethan Miller asked. Brian Harris turned to look at him, his eyes filled with both anger and disappointment. "Do I look okay?" Ethan Miller raised his hands in surrender. "Just asking."
Brian Harris didn't respond. He simply stood there, staring at the empty road, knowing that the dust left behind by Smith's car wasn't the only thing settling. His reputation and career all seemed to be crumbling right there on that empty stretch of land. Once General Smith's Caprice drove away, the highway returned to its usual silence. The dust from the massive vehicle quickly settled, but the air remained heavy. Brian Harris still stood there, his hands still in cuffs, as if unable to shake off the shock of what had just occurred. James Foster turned to look at Brian Harris again, his eyes clearly filled with disappointment. "I hope you can explain yourself tomorrow, because if this goes any further, I'm not sure I'll be able to protect you," James Foster said, his voice hard, no longer soft. Brian Harris could only nod stiffly, unable to utter a word. A part of him wanted to argue, but he knew that any excuse now would only make things worse. He felt the coldness in James Foster's gaze and understood that this time, his career could very well be over. Ethan Miller stood quietly behind, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had just witnessed an unimaginable scenario, and although he wasn't the one who'd made the mistake, he couldn't help but feel embarrassed. He glanced at Brian Harris, but dared not say anything. It felt as though everything was spiraling out of control for both of them. The atmosphere in the patrol car was almost eerily silent as they drove back to the station. No one spoke. Brian Harris sat in the passenger seat, his face emotionless, his gaze fixed out the window. Every time they passed another car, he imagined facing his colleagues, who would never look at him the same way again. When the car stopped in front of the station, James Foster broke the silence, his tone a final warning. "When you get home tonight, think long and hard about what happened. Don't make tomorrow any worse. I'll be waiting for you in my office tomorrow morning. And next time you want to be a hero, make sure you understand the situation you're dealing with." Brian Harris could only lower his head, unable to say anything. They stepped out of the car, and Ethan Miller took a step back, letting Brian Harris walk ahead. That night, none of them would sleep easily. Brian Harris knew that even if he managed to escape this incident, his reputation within the department had been severely damaged. The next morning, as Brian Harris walked into James Foster's office, the tension in the air was palpable. James Foster sat behind his desk, lightly tapping his fingers on the surface, his eyes never leaving Brian Harris. "You know, this wasn't just a minor incident. You handcuffed a general, and now we may face major legal consequences. Don't think an apology is enough," he said, his voice firm. Brian Harris sat down, his back straight, but the heavy feeling in his chest wouldn't lift. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was wrong. I didn't know what to do in that situation." James Foster stared at Brian Harris, as if trying to absorb every word. "Never forget that our job isn't just about acting on impulse. You're a police officer, and we have to act with reason, not emotion. And yesterday, you let your emotions take control." Brian Harris nodded, feeling as though every word James Foster said was tearing him apart. He knew he had made a grave mistake, and no matter what he said, it couldn't change the fact. Then, a crucial decision was made. Brian Harris would have to face the department's disciplinary board. An internal investigation would be launched to review all of his actions in the incident. If the results weren't favorable, Brian Harris would not only be suspended but might also face the possibility of termination. Meanwhile, Ethan Miller stood in the hallway, full of worry. He knew that although this incident wasn't his fault, he couldn't escape the feeling of guilt. What had happened made him question whether he was ready to make the tough decisions that this job required. He wasn't sure if he was prepared to face the challenges this profession presented. Later that day, after the meeting ended, Brian Harris left the office with a temporary decision. He would be suspended pending further investigation. In the meantime, any hope of restoring his reputation seemed distant. For James Foster and Ethan Miller, they knew this would be a major lesson for both of them, and what happened the previous day would never be forgotten. This story serves as a reminder of the importance of caution, thinking things through before acting, and how one wrong decision can change the course of a situation. If you were in Brian's shoes, what would you have done in that moment? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences and perspectives could offer valuable lessons to others. If you feel this story conveys deep values, don't hesitate to share it with friends and family, so we can all learn about professionalism and responsibility in our work. Thank you for following and supporting. Let's work together to build a society where every action is thoughtfully considered and responsible. Wishing you success and good fortune.